The beeping of the EKG was the only clock I had left, a steady, metronomic count of my final seconds on Earth, each pulse a reminder of the life draining out of me. The starched hospital sheets, tucked so tightly around my withered frame, felt like a shroud. I could smell the antiseptic, a clean, sharp scent that couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of decay. My own. From my bed in this gilded cage on the 50th floor, I could see the lights of Manhattan, a million glittering diamonds scattered across black velvet. Our city, the city I had helped him conquer. Richard sat beside me, his hand holding mine. His grip was warm, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my skin for the benefit of the news camera crew packed into the corner. His face, projected onto the giant screen of the news ticker across the street, was a perfect mask of grief. The concerned husband, Senator Richard Ashford, the political golden boy, watching his brilliant, tragic wife fade away. They called it a sudden, aggressive illness, a medical mystery. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. I had orchestrated a dozen unfortunate events for his political rivals. I had architected scandals, buried evidence, and ghost written the speeches that made the world fall in love with him. And now my own death was my final involuntary contribution to his narrative. "We're clear," the cameraman said, the red light on his rig blinking off. The shift was instantaneous. The warmth in Richard's hand vanished, replaced by the cool, indifferent weight of his fingers. The gentle circles stopped. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. He didn't let go of my hand. He simply possessed it, a trophy he'd already won. "Excellent performance, wouldn't you say?" he murmured, his voice a low purr that no longer had to pretend. He leaned in, the scent of his Tom Ford cologne, the one I'd bought him, filling my senses. The public loves a tragedy. The grieving husband forced to carry on the torch. The sympathy polls are through the roof. I tried to speak, to curse him, but my throat was a desert. My lungs, a pair of ruined bellows, could only manage a faint, rattling hiss. "Don't strain yourself," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "The doctors were quite specific. The toxin works on the nervous system first. You can hear everything, see everything, but you're trapped, a spectator at your own funeral." He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, a perfect silhouette against the city I had gifted him. "Vivian says hello, by the way. She's already picked out new drapes for the penthouse. I told her to wait, of course, for appearances. Vivian, my best friend, the one who brought me my special herbal tea every morning, the one who held my hand and cried when I was first admitted. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it was almost a work of art." Richard returned to the bedside, but this time he held a leather-bound portfolio. The snap of the clasps was loud in the sterile silence. He laid a document on the bed beside my useless hand. "Just one last piece of business," he said, his tone infuriatingly reasonable. "The controlling shares of the family trust. It's messy to leave them in the name of the deceased. The board gets difficult." My eyes screamed 1,000 curses at him. I willed my fingers to move, to claw at his face, to tear that document to shreds. Nothing. A flicker of an eyelid was the most I could manage. He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "I was hoping you'd be cooperative. No matter." He produced a second document from the portfolio, one I recognized with a jolt of ice-cold horror. It was from 3 years ago, from a time I thought his love was real when he told me it was just a formality to protect our assets during a volatile campaign. "The power of attorney, darling," he purred, holding it up. "The key to the kingdom, signed, sealed, and delivered. You were always so trusting." The Mont Blanc pen, my anniversary gift to him, weighed exactly 42 grams in his hand. I remembered because I'd had it custom engraved. He uncapped it with a soft click. The nib, a sliver of polished gold, touched the parchment of the new transfer agreement. The sound was like a scalpel slicing skin. I watched the black ink bloom across the paper, a liquid darkness that was consuming my entire world. His hand moved with an elegant, practiced grace, forming the letters of his name over the signature line. He was signing away my life's work, my inheritance, everything my father had built, with a pen I had given him. He was using my own love as the weapon to erase me. The pen lifted. The ink was still wet, gleaming under the cold hospital lights. The trap, set years ago, had finally sprung. He held the signed document up for me to see, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice smooth as venom. "Your name will be on the foundation, but Vivian's will be on the deed." This was the mic drop, the final, perfect insult. My legacy reduced to a tax write-off, while my best friend slept in my bed on my money. He placed the document carefully back into his portfolio. Then he turned to the wall of machines that were keeping me alive. His hand, so steady, reached for the primary monitor of my life support system. He didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around the power cable. My pulse, displayed in jagged green lines, remained perfectly flat. My body was too weak even for a surge of adrenaline. There was only the silent primal scream inside my skull. He pulled the plug. The sudden silence was more violent than any explosion. It was followed by a single, unending, high-pitched tone, the flat line. My vision began to tunnel, the glittering city lights blurring into a smear of gold. The sound of the flat line faded, replaced by the echo of his voice. He'd already pulled out his phone. I couldn't make out the words, but I could see his silhouette against the window, his head thrown back. He was laughing. As the last of my consciousness slipped away, I heard one clear, final phrase cut through the darkness. "It's done," he said, his voice bright with victory. "Book the flight to Monaco." My life for his vacation. In that last black moment, a cold certainty formed, not a thought, not an emotion, but a law of physics waiting to be enacted. This was not the end, it was the beginning. The air rushing into my lungs tasted of dust, polish, and the faint, sweet scent of gardenias. It wasn't the sterile bite of the hospital. I gasped, my body jerking upright with a violence that made the heavy mahogany bed frame groan. I was clutching at my chest, expecting the phantom pain of my failing organs, the suffocating weight of my last breath. But my hands were strong, unblemished, and they weren't wired to machines. I stared wildly at the room, the pale green wallpaper, the antique vanity mirror, the Persian rug. This wasn't a penthouse. This was my old room in the Vance family townhouse on the Upper East Side. I snatched the phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up with an impossible truth. October 25th, 3 years ago, the day before my life had effectively ended, the day before I signed the first iteration of the power of attorney that gave Richard Ashford the keys to my kingdom. A cold, clinical clarity washed over me. I wasn't just alive, I was armed with a timeline, a 3-year ledger of betrayals, stolen ideas, and the precise anatomy of his rise and my fall. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the solid oak floor beneath my bare feet. A predatory thrill hummed in my veins. The rules of the game hadn't changed, but the player had. The doorknob turned. Cynthia, my stepmother, sailed into the room. She was a vision in beige cashmere, her face artfully arranged into an expression of maternal concern that didn't quite reach her perfectly lined eyes. She smelled of expensive hairspray and ambition. "Elena, darling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial honey, "you gave us such a fright. Dr. Evans said it was just exhaustion, but still—" She glided to the bedside table, her eyes darting to a silver tray carrying a familiar, ornate silver picture frame. Inside was a smiling, deceitful Richard. I watched her gaze linger there, a silent calculation I'd missed entirely in my first life. "We need you strong, Elena," Cynthia continued, adjusting the cuffs of her sweater. "Richard needs you. His campaign is at a critical juncture." She placed a sleek black leather folio onto the bedspread. It was heavy, embossed with the gold seal of our family trust lawyers. The very sight of it sent a jolt of ice down my spine, a visceral echo of the hospital room. "It's just a formality, dear," she murmured, tapping a manicured fingernail against the leather, "to ensure the foundation's funds are flexible to support Richard. We all have to make sacrifices for the family's future. Sacrifices like my life, like my legacy." "It's a simple legal document," she added, her tone sharpening slightly when I didn't immediately reach for it. "Your father would want you to be a team player. Richard is counting on you." I looked at the folio, then I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. I didn't feel anger. Anger was a messy, uncontrolled emotion. What I felt was the chilling, precise focus of a sniper finding their mark. The heavy, expensive paper of the document rustled slightly as she opened the folio. The scent of fresh ink and ambition filled the space between us. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, ready to hand over my power on a silver platter. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick-tock a countdown to the moment she expected me to submit, to become the obedient, useful idiot I had once been. Her eyes were wide, a pleading, but her jaw was set in a tight, demanding line. She thought she was reeling in a guppy. She didn't realize she was baiting a shark. "A formality," I repeated, my voice devoid of inflection, a flat line mimicking the one I'd heard in the hospital. "Exactly," she beamed, relieved that the exhausted Elena was playing along. She handed me a pen. Not a Mont Blanc, just a heavy gold-plated ballpoint. The weight of it felt wrong in my hand, a cheap imitation of the instrument of my destruction. I took the pen. I let the silence stretch, thick and oppressive. I watched the confident smile on Cynthia's face falter slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Without a word, I leaned over the document. I didn't look at the dense legalese, the clauses designed to strip me of my agency. I focused entirely on the signature line. I pressed the nib to the paper. Instead of the elegant flowing script of my name, I drew a sharp, aggressive line. The gold pen scratched against the thick parchment, a harsh, tearing sound. I wrote a single bold word across the dotted line. "No." I capped the pen with a sharp, decisive click. The sound snapped like a gunshot in the quiet room. I tossed the pen onto the voided document. Cynthia stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing silently like a landed fish. The blood drained from her face, her carefully constructed mask shattering to reveal the panicked opportunist beneath. "Elena, what is this?" she stammered, her voice shrill, stripped of its honeyed coating. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk pajamas. The air in the room felt lighter, the oppressive tension broken by my single act of defiance. I looked at her, my expression as cold and unforgiving as marble. "It's a formality, Cynthia," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "A formality to inform you that the bank of Elena Vance is permanently closed." I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the ruined document and the ghost of the woman she thought she could control. I was halfway down the mahogany staircase when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, the screen glowing in the dim light of the hallway. A text from Richard. "What's this? I hear about a problem with the paperwork. Call me." I stared at the name, a predator's glint sharpening in my eyes. The game had begun. My thumb hovered over the screen, savoring the moment before I pressed the single most satisfying button of my new life: block. The silence in the townhouse was different now. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of obedience, it was the tense, coiled energy of a drawn bowstring. I had blocked Richard. I had dismissed Cynthia. Now I needed ammunition. In my previous life, I had been the architect of Richard's empire, a brilliant, unseen algorithm architect who built his political and financial models. But I had built them for him. I had naive, romantic notions of shared success. This time, the only empire I was building was my own, and its foundation would be laid in his ashes. I locked the door to my study, the heavy oak clicking shut with a satisfying finality. The room was exactly as I remembered it, walls lined with first editions, a vintage globe, and the faint smell of old leather. But the true power in this room lay hidden beneath the floorboards. I knelt, pressing the precise sequence of knots in the wood. A hidden panel popped open. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a matte black hard drive. This drive held a dormant crypto wallet, a relic from my early days experimenting with blockchain algorithms before Richard convinced me that traditional finance was the only respectable path. It contained a seed fund I'd nearly forgotten about, $500,000, untraceable and clean. I connected the drive to my secure air-gapped laptop. The interface bloomed to life, lines of glowing green code reflecting in my eyes like a digital heartbeat. I wasn't just accessing funds, I was accessing a memory. In exactly 72 hours, an obscure biotech firm named OmniGen was going to announce the catastrophic failure of their highly anticipated Alzheimer's drug trial. The CEO, a friend of Richard's, was currently suppressing the data to quietly offload his stock. The resulting crash would wipe out thousands of investors. I opened a secure communication channel to my offshore broker, a phantom entity I knew only as Viper. Viper, I typed, my fingers flying across the keys with the precision of a concert pianist. "I need a position." The reply was instantaneous. Target, Omnigen, ticker OMNG, position, maximum short sell. Every cent, leverage it. I watched the blinking cursor. To short sell meant betting heavily that the stock would plummet. If I was wrong, I'd owe millions I didn't have. If I was right, I'd turn my seed money into a war chest, leverage it to the maximum. Yes, I'm sure. The word you're looking for is catastrophic. I hit send. The heavy, satisfying click of the enter key echoed in the silent study, a digital guillotine dropping on OmniGen's future. The transaction was logged, processed, and buried in the layers of encrypted routing. I watched the confirmation screen, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. The trap was set. That evening, the annual Vance Foundation charity auction was held at the Pierre Hotel. It was a glittering, superficial affair, the air thick with perfume and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I wore a backless emerald gown, a sharp departure from the demure, pastel dresses Richard always preferred. I wasn't here to be arm candy, I was here to hunt. The ballroom was a sea of Manhattan's elite. Politicians, hedge fund managers, socialites, all oblivious to the storm I was brewing. I spotted Richard across the room, working the crowd, his smile flawless, his charm weaponized. Beside him stood Vivian, my best friend, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight of them, a perfect picture of deceit, didn't anger me. It merely sharpened my focus. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in emerald silk. I ignored the whispers and the curious glances. I was looking for a specific target, not a victim, but a weapon. I found him near the ice sculpture, nursing a tumbler of scotch. Theodore Theo Sterling. Theo was the black sheep of the Sterling family, a dynasty that rivaled the Vances in wealth but surpassed us in ruthlessness. He was known as a playboy, a wastrel who spent his trust fund on fast cars and faster women. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath the rumpled tuxedo and the slurred speech lay a mind as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. He played the fool to survive his own family's lethal politics. I approached him, the clinking of ice in his glass, a counterpoint to the stringed quartet playing in the background. Theodore, I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise. He turned, his eyes, a startling icy blue, focusing on me with an intensity that belied his slouched posture. He took a sip of his scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandeliers. Elena Vance, he drawled, his voice a low rumble. I hear you're causing trouble, blocking the golden boy's calls, refusing to sign the family silver away. Word travels fast in small circles, I replied, my tone neutral. He leaned closer, the scent of expensive scotch and danger rolling off him. You look different, Elena, less domesticated. I've recently acquired a taste for independence, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Theo chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. Independence is expensive. What are you investing in to afford it? I smiled, a slow, predatory curving of my lips. I leaned in, ensuring my voice was meant for him alone. Failure. Theo's eyes narrowed, the playboy facade cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing the shark beneath. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He recognized the scent of blood in the water. Interesting portfolio choice, he murmured, swirling the ice in his glass. 3 days later, the news broke. The television in my study was tuned to a financial news network. The anchor's voice was frantic, the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen a blur of red. Breaking news, catastrophic trial failure for OmniGen, CEO under investigation for insider trading, stock price in free fall, down 98%. I watched the red line on the graph plummet, a digital representation of a company's demise. The frantic shouting of traders on the news clip washed over me, a symphony of chaos. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, dark satisfaction. My initial 500,000 had multiplied exponentially. I was no longer a victim. I was a player with a $50 million stake in the game. I picked up my burner phone and drafted a text to the encrypted number I'd secured from Theo's accidental dropped business card at the gala. Checkmate. I hit send, the sound of the enter key finalizing my transition from prey to predator. The war chest was full. Now it was time to deploy the troops. The burner phone vibrated in my hand, a harsh, mechanical buzz against my palm. I looked at the screen. A single, incoming message from the encrypted number. Theo replied, I'm in, but my price is Richard Ashford's entire political machine in ruins. I stared at the glowing text, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. The alliance was forged. Richard thought he was playing politics. He didn't know we were playing for annihilation. The scent of white patchouli entered the library exactly 3 seconds before he did. Richard never knocked when he assumed he owned the territory. The heavy mahogany doors of the Vance family study swung open, the brass hinges gliding in utter silence. He stood framed in the doorway wearing a bespoke midnight blue Brioni suit that draped flawlessly across his shoulders. The camera-ready smile was firmly in place, the one that conveyed a mixture of boyish charm and statesman-like gravitas. It was the same smile he had worn in the hospital room just before he reached for the power cable of my ventilator. A sharp, metallic tang coated the back of my tongue. My spine pressed against the rigid leather of the Chesterfield chair, ensuring my posture was ruthlessly straight. My pulse maintained a flat, steady rhythm. I knew you couldn't stay away, Elena, Richard said, his voice a meticulously calibrated baritone that resonated off the vaulted ceiling. He strolled to the antique mahogany desk, casually picking up a crystal paperweight and turning it over in his hands. This clean energy initiative, the Helios Project, it's nothing without you. Well, almost nothing. He set the paperweight down with a dull thud. The implication was clear. I was a useful asset, but ultimately replaceable. He needed the core algorithm, the proprietary predictive model I had spent 2 years coding, the engine that made his green energy platform financially viable to the hawks on Wall Street. His current engineering team, composed of overpaid sycophants, couldn't untangle the underlying math to save their lives. He rested his palms flat on the desk, leaning in. His cologne was overpowering now, suffocating the natural scent of old paper and dust. The Super PAC donors are restless, Elena. We have the gala tonight at the Waldorf. The tote board needs to hit 9 figures. I need the final optimization patch. For us, my jaw tightened, the molars grinding together with a microscopic click. I looked at his perfectly manicured hands, imagining them pulling a life support plug from a wall socket. You're right, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, frictionless murmur. It's our legacy. I shouldn't let my feelings get in the way. I opened the top drawer of the desk. The hinges offered a faint metallic whisper. Inside lay a sleek, matte black casing. The USB drive weighed exactly 14 grams. Its anodized aluminum shell was cold against the pad of my thumb, absorbing the ambient temperature of the climate-controlled library. As I lifted it from the velvet-lined drawer, the overhead chandelier caught the slight bevel of its edge, casting a razor-thin shadow across my palm. Inside this tiny, innocuous piece of hardware slept a digital apex predator. I had spent the last 48 hours weaving a Trojan horse into the foundational architecture of the Helios code. To his engineers, the patch would look like a brilliant, flawless optimization of the power grid distribution model. It would pass every diagnostic test. It would compile perfectly. But buried beneath 3 million lines of standard C++ was a highly sophisticated logic bomb. I hadn't just sabotaged the code, I had given it a hyper-specific hunger. I had tied the execution trigger directly to the API of the Gala's live donation tracker. The malware would sleep completely undetectable until the incoming data stream registered a total pledge amount crossing the $100 million threshold. I extended my arm. The 14 grams of metal hovered in the space between us. Richard's eyes darted from my face to the drive, a flicker of greedy relief washing over his perfectly symmetrical features. The friction of his fingertips brushing against mine sent a localized chill up my forearm. The transfer took less than a second. He snatched the drive, his thumb immediately rubbing the matte surface as if polishing a newly acquired gemstone. The leather of his suit shifted as he slipped the drive into his breast pocket, placing it right next to his heart. "I knew you'd see reason," he murmured, adjusting his silk tie. He turned his back to me, already calculating his victory speech. "Watch the live stream tonight, Elena. You'll want to see this." I watched his retreating back until the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him. The scent of his cologne lingered like a toxic spill. I picked up a sterile cloth from the desk drawer and meticulously wiped down the crystal paperweight he had touched. 4 hours later, the sterile cold of a rented, unfurnished safe house in Tribeca surrounded me. There were no Persian rugs here, no antique globes, just raw concrete floors, a steel folding chair, and a high-end encrypted laptop glowing in the dark. The blue light from the monitor washed over my face, reflecting in the lenses of my glasses. On the screen, the Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom was a sea of black tie opulence. The camera panned over tables laden with orchids and crystal, settling on the massive LED screen dominating the main stage. The digital tote board in the top right corner of the live stream blinked steadily. $84,500,000. The audio feed piped the ambient noise of wealth into my quiet room, the clinking of heavy silver cutlery against bone china, the low, confident murmur of Manhattan's elite trading favors. Richard stepped up to the podium. The applause was a thunderous wave, validating every lie he had ever sold them. He gripped the edges of the lectern, leaning into the microphone. "We stand on the precipice of a new era." Richard's voice echoed through the speakers, dripping with manufactured sincerity. "The Helios project isn't just an investment, it is a promise to our children." Behind him, the massive LED screen displayed the interactive grid, my grid. It showed pulsing blue lines representing optimized energy distribution across the eastern seaboard. It was beautiful. It was flawless. $92,100,000. With your support, we don't just predict the future, we command it. $97,800,000. The camera cut to Vivian in the front row. She was wearing a diamond necklace that had originally belonged to my grandmother. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, playing the moved, supportive partner to perfection. My fingernails bit into the meat of my palms, carving sharp, half-moon crescents into the skin. $99,500,000. A waiter on the feed popped a cork from a magnum of Dom Perignon. The sharp, celebratory crack reverberated through the audio feed. $100 million. The threshold was breached. On the screen, Richard raised a champagne flute. "To Helios!" he proclaimed. He didn't notice the screen behind him, but the audience did. The collective gasp from 500 billionaires sucked the oxygen out of the ballroom. The sound was a sharp, localized vacuum, followed immediately by the shattering of crystal as someone dropped a glass. The pulsing blue lines of the energy grid on the massive LED screen froze. A harsh, digital tearing sound ripped through the PA system, overriding Richard's microphone with a high-pitched, distorted screech. The blue lines violently shifted to a bloody, flashing red. The map of the eastern seaboard began to collapse. Warning vectors multiplied exponentially, crawling across the screen like a digital virus. The simulation showed cascading power plant failures, substations going offline, and urban centers plunging into total darkness. The projected loss of revenue counter spun out of control, hitting billions in negative deficit within seconds. Richard turned around, his champagne flute frozen halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face with the speed of a severed artery. His mouth opened, but the PA system was entirely hijacked by the deafening, rhythmic blare of a simulated catastrophic meltdown alert. Then the chaotic red maps vanished. The 70-foot screen plunged into a stark, blinding black. In the center of the darkness, a single string of glowing, monospaced white text materialized, hovering over Richard's head like a guillotine blade. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The cameras zoomed in on Richard's face. The charismatic mask was gone, replaced by the naked, twitching panic of a man realizing he was standing on a landmine that had just detonated. The super PAC donors, men and women who destroyed companies before breakfast, were staring at him not as a future president, but as a liability. I reached out and pressed the smooth, cool surface of the laptop's lid, pushing it down until the latch clicked. The room plunged into darkness. The silence in my Spartan apartment was thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the absolute pandemonium I had just unleashed upon the Waldorf. A slow, rhythmic exhale pushed past my lips, cooling the air in front of me. The burner phone resting on the concrete floor vibrated, its harsh mechanical buzzing shattering the quiet. The screen illuminated, displaying an unknown, highly encrypted offshore number. I let it ring 3 times, counting the pulses before swiping the green icon. "Miss Vance," a voice rasped through the speaker. It was Arthur Sterling, the lead donor of the Super PAC, a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small nations. The ambient noise of the panicked Gala echoed faintly in the background of his call. "I am pulling my 40 million, and my lawyers are contacting the federal authorities regarding investor fraud. I presume you have the real data." My thumb hovered over the record button. The empire was burning, and the rats were already offering me the keys to the ashes. The air in the boardroom of the Vance Foundation headquarters was always a controlled 68 degrees, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old money. I sat at the head of the 20-foot expanse of polished walnut, a singular figure in a charcoal gray Armani suit, my posture rigid, my breathing shallow and metered. The 8 other members of the board, mostly elderly men in bespoke pinstripes, shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The silence was absolute save for the rhythmic tapping of my Mont Blanc pen, a new one, matte black, against a stack of crisp white paper. The fallout from the Waldorf Gala was still raining down like ash. Richard's campaign was hemorrhaging capital faster than a severed artery. The heavy double doors swung open, the brass handles gleaming under the recessed lighting. Richard entered, his usual effortless stride replaced by a hurried, almost frantic pace. He wore the same suit from the night before, the pristine midnight blue fabric now wrinkled, the knot of his silk tie pulled loose. The smell of stale champagne and desperation clung to him, a sharp contrast to the sterile air of the room. He didn't bother greeting the board. His eyes, rimmed with red and wide with a manic energy, locked onto me. "Elena," he said, his voice a tight, controlled hiss. "What is the meaning of this? Why are the primary accounts flagged?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, savoring the microscopic twitch in a muscle near his left eye. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted, and I intended to make him feel the tectonic plates moving beneath his feet. I slowly lifted a single sheet of paper from the stack before me, the crisp edge cutting through the air with a faint, papery whisper. It was the quarterly financial statement of the Vance Foundation, heavily annotated with red ink. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice a calm, even current that barely disturbed the silence of the room. "We are gathered here today to fulfill our fiduciary duty to this trust." I placed the paper back on the desk, aligning its edges perfectly with the mahogany inlay. The precision of the movement was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around Richard. Over the past 48 hours, it has come to my attention that the co-chair of this foundation, Senator Ashford, has engaged in a pattern of behavior that can only be described as gross mismanagement. "Mismanagement?" Richard scoffed, his hands gripping the back of an empty leather chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "The gala was a technical glitch, a sabotage by a disgruntled employee. My team is fixing it right now." He was lying, of course. His team was panicking, drowning in 3 million lines of compromised code they couldn't even begin to decipher. The logic bomb had effectively sterilized the entire server farm. I turned my head slightly, pinning him with a gaze as cold and unyielding as a glacier. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "The technical failure at the Waldorf was merely the catalyst, Richard," I said, the words slipping past my lips like shards of ice. "A symptom of a much deeper rot. I am referring to the unauthorized transfer of foundation assets to a series of shell corporations under the guise of campaign consulting fees." A collective intake of breath rippled around the table. The older board members exchanged alarmed glances, the subtle rustle of worsted wool filling the silence. Richard's jaw slackened for a fraction of a second, the charismatic facade cracking to reveal the raw panic underneath. He hadn't expected me to find the offshore accounts so quickly. He hadn't expected me to track the money. "You have no proof of that," he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual resonant depth. It sounded thin, brittle. I didn't argue. I didn't need to present a thesis. I simply pushed a thick bound folder across the polished walnut table. The leather cover slid smoothly, stopping exactly halfway between us. It was a dossier compiled by Viper, detailing every illicit wire transfer, every dummy corporation, every penny diverted from the Vance Foundation into his political war chest. "I am not here to debate, Richard," I stated, the cold detachment in my chest settling into a precise, freezing calm. "I am here to execute a vote of no confidence." The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The board members leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the dossier like it was a live grenade. "You can't do this," Richard hissed, his hands leaving the chair and slamming flat onto the table, leaning aggressively toward me. "I am the co-chair. I have signature authority." "You had signature authority," I corrected, my tone pleasant, almost conversational. I picked up my matte black Mont Blanc pen. The weight of it was satisfying, grounding. Effective as of 8 a.m. this morning, I invoked Clause 4, Section B of the Founding Charter, emergency suspension of executive privileges in the event of suspected financial malfeasance. I clicked the pen open, the tiny mechanical sound echoing in the silent room. The accounts are frozen, Richard, all of them, the joint checking, the campaign reserves, the discretionary funds, everything. He stared at me, his chest heaving, the realization dawning in his bloodshot eyes. He wasn't just losing an argument, he was losing his lifeblood. A politician without access to capital is a dead man walking. You bitch, he spat, the word devoid of its usual polished delivery, raw and ugly. You think you can just cut me off? I built this campaign. I built this platform. You built a house of cards on my blueprints, I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room's attention. And now the wind is blowing. I turned my attention back to the board members. Gentlemen, the motion is on the table, a vote to permanently sever Senator Ashford's operational control over the Vance Foundation assets. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. They were old men, accustomed to quiet agreements and discreet transactions. This blatant, brutal power struggle unnerved them, but they were also men who understood money, and the dossier sitting on the table was a clear, undeniable threat to their own positions. One by one, the hands went up. The movement was slow, hesitant, but unanimous. The motion carries, I announced, the finality of the words settling over the room like dust. Richard stood frozen, his hands still splayed on the mahogany table. The charismatic aura that usually surrounded him was gone, evaporated. He looked small, diminished, like a suit that had been emptied of its occupant. This isn't over, Elena, he said, his voice trembling with a potent mix of rage and impotence. I'll tie you up in litigation for decades. I'll make sure you never see a dime of that money. I didn't look at him. I unscrewed the cap of my pen and began signing the formal execution orders, the ink flowing smoothly, black and decisive. Fix what, Richard? I murmured, not lifting my eyes from the paperwork. As I recall, you signed the transfer papers 3 years ago. It's your problem now. I finished signing the last document and closed the folder with a soft thud. I looked up, meeting his manic, desperate gaze one last time. Security, I called out, my voice clear and unwavering. The heavy double doors opened immediately. Two men in dark suits stepped into the room, their presence a silent, imposing threat. Please escort Mr. Ashford from the premises, I instructed, my tone as polite as if I were asking for a glass of water. He no longer has access clearance. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred as the security guards flanked him. He opened his mouth to scream, to threaten, to beg, but no sound came out. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him, sealing him outside the empire he thought he owned. I remained seated at the head of the table, the ambient hum of the city filtering through the reinforced glass. My phone buzzed on the table. A calendar alert flashed on the screen. Omnigen short sell options mature, 12 p.m. The blood flow was cut. Now it was time to watch him suffocate. The notification on my phone vanished, replaced by the sterile, glowing numbers of my offshore banking app. The balance sat at an even, impossible $50 million. The Omnigen short sell had executed perfectly. The market had bled, and I had caught the hemorrhage in a bucket. I didn't smile. I just felt the heavy, vibrating hum of my phone against the mahogany table. It was Richard. Again. The screen flashed his name, Richard Ashford, Mobile. It was the 14th call in the last 3 hours. I picked up the device, the sleek glass and metal cool against my palm. I slid my thumb across the screen, not to answer, but to decline. The buzzing stopped instantly, leaving the quiet, opulent air of the boardroom undisturbed. He was drowning, and the surface was getting further away with every passing second. My laptop chimed, a discreet, single note that cut through the silence. It was an encrypted email from Viper, my broker. Attached was a heavily redacted PDF. I clicked it open, the stark white background illuminating the harsh reality of Richard's impending doom. The document detailed a coordinated, multi pronged attack on Helios Energy, the cornerstone of Richard's campaign platform. The logic bomb I'd planted had done more than just embarrass him at the Waldorf. It had triggered an automatic, cascading failure across their entire server architecture. The code was eating itself. The email from Viper contained a single line of text. The vultures are circling. Initiate hostile takeover protocol. I leaned back in the Chesterfield chair, the leather creaking softly in protest. A hostile takeover. It was a beautiful, savage concept. To buy enough distressed shares of a failing company to force out the existing management, essentially stealing the entity out from under them. And Richard's company was about as distressed as it could get. I tapped a few keys, initiating the sequence. $50 million, funneled through a labyrinth of shell corporations, began to quietly purchase every available share of Helios Energy at pennies on the dollar. The market was panic selling, and I was the only buyer in the room. My phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't Richard. It was Vivian. I stared at the name, a slow, dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. Vivian, my best friend, the woman who was currently sleeping in my bed, wearing my jewelry and preparing to step into my life. She was calling because the money had stopped flowing. The foundation accounts were frozen, and the credit cards Richard had given her were declining at Hermes and Cartier. I let it ring. The harsh, mechanical buzzing was a symphony of her rising panic. When it finally went to voicemail, I imagined her standing in a high end boutique, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as the sales associate politely informed her that the transaction could not be completed. The screen went dark. I turned my attention back to the laptop. The takeover was almost complete. My screen displayed a pie chart of Helios Energy's ownership. The slice representing my shell corporations was growing steadily, eating away at Richard's diminishing control. Then the final blow landed. A news alert popped up on my secondary monitor. It was a live broadcast from the financial district. A reporter, looking breathless and triumphant, stood outside the towering glass facade of Helios Energy headquarters. Unprecedented chaos at Helios Energy today, the reporter shouted over the din of traffic and frantic employees rushing out of the building with cardboard boxes. Following the catastrophic failure of their proprietary algorithm during a major fundraising gala, sources confirm a mass exodus of their core engineering team. But the real story is breaking just now. The camera panned to show a fleet of dark sedans pulling up to the curb. Men and women in sharp suits, carrying briefcases, began pouring out. We have confirmed that attorneys representing major institutional investors have filed an emergency injunction to liquidate assets. The company is hemorrhaging capital, and creditors are moving in to salvage what they can. Liquidate assets. They were carving up the carcass before it was even cold. I watched the screen, the blue light reflecting in the lenses of my glasses. The chaos was absolute, a perfect, controlled demolition. Richard's dream, built on my stolen intellect, was collapsing in real time. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Tio. Turn on channel 4. I clicked the remote. The massive plasma screen on the boardroom wall flared to life. The news anchor looked grave, shuffling papers on his desk. In a stunning development, we are receiving reports that the United States Securities and Exchange Commission has formally launched an SEC investigation into Senator Richard Ashford and the financial practices surrounding the Helios project. The SEC investigation, the final nail in the coffin. Theo had delivered on his promise. He had leaked the dossier, providing the federal authorities with enough evidence of wire fraud and embezzlement to bury Richard under a mountain of federal charges. The anchor continued, his voice tight with the magnitude of the story. Sources within the Justice Department indicate that a federal subpoena is currently being served at Senator Ashford's Manhattan residence, demanding all financial records pertaining to the Vance Foundation. I muted the television, the silence rushing back into the room. A subpoena. They were coming for the very documents I had secured in my offshore accounts. Richard was trapped. He had no money, no company, and now the federal government was knocking on his door. He was suffocating, the oxygen of his power and influence completely cut off. I stood up, the charcoal gray Armani suit immaculate and unwrinkled. I walked over to the floor to ceiling window, looking out over the city that was currently tearing Richard Ashford apart. The air in the boardroom remained a perfect 68 degrees, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old money, but the scent of victory, sharp and intoxicating, was beginning to permeate the space. My phone screen lit up one last time, a harsh glare in the dimming afternoon light. It was an email from Richard, sent to my personal, heavily encrypted address. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. The subject line was enough. Subject, please. I stared at the single word, a pathetic, desperate plea from a man who had built his empire on my stolen genius. My thumb hovered over the delete button, the pad of my finger pressing into the glass. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I didn't delete the email. I simply closed the laptop, the screen going black, leaving his final word hanging in the dark. It was time for the final act. The silence of the Tribeca safe house was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the high-end server tower cooling its processors. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the glow of 3 encrypted monitors illuminating my face in stark, unforgiving angles. The air tasted of ozone and ozone-purified coffee. I had the dossier, 500 pages of raw, unadulterated wire fraud. This wasn't a spreadsheet. It was an autopsy report of Richard's political soul. It detailed every shell company, every Cayman Island account, every convoluted transaction where he had siphoned charitable donations from the Vance Foundation into his personal super PACs. The embezzlement was breathtaking in its audacity, a labyrinth of deceit that only a man blinded by his own invincibility would construct. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just the brain behind the curtain, incapable of pulling the strings. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp and distinct. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, resting lightly on the cool plastic. The email client was open, the recipient field filled with the personal, encrypted address of Margaret Sterling, the Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist at the New York Times. She was a woman known for tearing down empires over a single misplaced comma. I didn't write a clever subject line or a dramatic introduction. I simply dragged the encrypted zip file containing the entire ledger of Richard's dark money operations into the attachment field. The progress bar filled, a solid bright blue line charging across the screen. 10%, 50%, 100%. The file was attached. I pressed send. The single keystroke echoed in the empty room, a dull thwack that carried the weight of a firing squad's volley. The email vanished into the ether, untraceable, undeniable. The match was struck. All that remained was to watch the explosion. My burner phone vibrated, grinding against the concrete floor. I picked it up. The cold metal housing was a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the servers. It was Theo. Channel 5. His voice crackled through the speaker, thrumming with dark anticipation. Grab popcorn. I grabbed the remote and flicked on the wall-mounted television. The screen flared to life, filling the room with the frantic energy of a breaking news bulletin. The anchor's face was grave, her hands shuffling papers with a hurried intensity. We are interrupting our regular broadcast for a developing story of monumental proportions, the anchor announced, her voice tight. The New York Times has just published an explosive expose detailing what they call the largest campaign finance scandal in a generation. The screen split, showing the bold black and white digital front page of the Times. The headline screamed in large font, Senator Ashford's Dark Money Empire, a trail of fraud and embezzlement. Documents obtained by the Times reportedly show a systematic, multi-year operation to funnel millions of dollars from the charitable Vance Foundation directly into Senator Richard Ashford's presidential super PAC. The camera cut to a live shot outside the towering glass and steel of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Reporters and camera crews were swarming like locusts, their microphones thrust toward the heavy wooden doors. Legal experts are calling the evidence irrefutable, the reporter shouted, citing a staggering paper trail of wire fraud that could result in decades of federal prison time. I leaned back against the cool concrete wall, the blue light of the television washing over me. The satisfaction wasn't a sudden rush. It was a slow, freezing expansion in my chest. The empire he built on my intellect was collapsing under the weight of his own greed. The phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't Theo. It was a number I recognized, one I hadn't blocked yet. Vivian. I answered, not speaking. I simply waited. Elena, Vivian's voice was shrill, trembling with panic. Elena, please tell me you are watching this. Tell me it is a mistake. I am watching, Vivian, I replied, my voice steady and cold. And the Times rarely makes mistakes of this magnitude. They froze the accounts, she cried out in disbelief. The black card, the joint checking, even the trust fund access you set up for me. It is all gone. I tried to buy a coffee, Elena, and my card was declined. The image of her, standing in a boutique coffee shop, adorned in my stolen jewelry, humiliated over a $5 latte, was a masterpiece of irony. The board instituted an emergency freeze pending a federal investigation. I stated calmly, reciting the facts like a weather report. Standard protocol when the co-chair is accused of massive embezzlement. But Richard said, she choked on a sob, the realization crashing down on her. He said you were just having a breakdown. He said the foundation money was secure. Richard says a lot of things, Vivian, I murmured, my eyes fixed on the television screen where pundits were already debating the length of his prison sentence. He told me he loved me right before he signed away my life. I suggest you find a very good lawyer. Elena, please, she begged, the desperation bleeding through the phone. I didn't know about the dark money. I wanted the life he promised. Ignorance is not a recognized legal defense, I said softly, and complicity is a very ugly look. I ended the call, the silence returning to the safe house. Vivian was collateral damage, a parasite who had attached herself to a sinking ship. She would drown with him. On the television, the scene shifted to a press conference. An official from the Department of Justice stood behind a podium adorned with the seal of the United States. The microphones clustered before him resembled a bouquet of mechanical flowers. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the Department of Justice, in conjunction with the FBI and the SEC, has formally opened a criminal investigation into Senator Richard Ashford. The words were a death knell. The official continued, detailing the severity of the charges, the breadth of the wire fraud, and the impending subpoenas. My laptop chimed, signaling another incoming encrypted message. It was from a contact within the DOJ, someone Theo had cultivated. The rats are fleeing. V is currently in the lobby of the federal building in Foley Square. She's demanding to see a prosecutor. I stared at the message, a cold, sharp smile cutting across my face. Vivian, the loyal mistress, was already trying to secure a plea deal. She was rushing to offer up Richard on a silver platter in exchange for immunity. The ultimate betrayal delivered by the very woman he had chosen over me. The collapse was total. He was financially ruined, politically dead, and personally abandoned. He was a man screaming in a vacuum, suffocating on the fumes of his own destroyed ambition. I picked up the burner phone and dialed Richard's personal, unlisted number, the one he thought only a handful of people had. I bypassed the voicemail and initiated a direct, untraceable connection. The line clicked open. I could hear his ragged, uneven breathing, the sound of a man who realized the walls were closing in. Elena, he rasped, his voice stripped of all its polished charm, sounding small and terrified. Please, tell me you didn't do this. I didn't answer. I simply held the phone near the speaker of the television, turning up the volume just as the news anchor announced the imminent arrival of federal agents at his Hamptons estate. I let the words hang in the air, a final, damning sentence, before I ended the call, leaving him alone in the dark to wait for the knock on the door. The teakwood deck of Theo's 80-foot Sunseeker yacht gently rose and fell with the swells of the Atlantic. We were anchored 3 miles off the coast of Montauk, enveloped by the cool, salt-heavy air of an early autumn night. The only illumination came from the yacht's muted deck lights and the soft, ambient glow of the tablet resting on the glass table between us. Theo sat across from me, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 resting loosely in his hand. He wore a simple navy cashmere sweater, the picture of a man who had already won the war. I wore a white silk slip dress, a stark contrast to the darkness of the ocean and the darkness of the business we were concluding. The tablet screen displayed a high-definition encrypted live stream feed. It was patched directly into a security camera mounted on a utility pole across the street from Richard's sprawling 10,000 square foot Hamptons estate. The estate was a monument to his stolen hubris, a modern glass and steel fortress that he had purchased using the very embezzlement funds I had just exposed to the world. It was quiet now, the long, winding driveway empty, the massive windows glowing warmly against the night. "Any minute now," Theo murmured, the ice clinking softly against the sides of his glass. His icy blue eyes were fixed on the screen, reflecting the digital feed. I didn't reply. I just watched. The clinical detachment that had sustained me for 3 years, since the moment I woke up in my childhood bed with the memory of a sword in my chest, had crystallized into something infinitely harder. On the screen, the tranquility of the Hamptons night was suddenly violently shattered. A convoy of matte black SUVs, their headlights cut, materialized from the darkness of the private road. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. As they converged on the estate's wrought iron gates, the lead vehicle didn't slow down. The heavy, reinforced bumper slammed into the ornate metalwork with a kinetic force that I could almost feel through the tablet. The gates buckled and gave way. "Showtime," Theo whispered, taking a slow sip of his scotch. The SUVs flooded the circular driveway. The moment they halted, the doors flew open. Dozens of agents wearing dark windbreakers and tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI swarmed the property. They moved like a coordinated strike force, fanning out to secure the perimeter and covering the main entrance. Two agents carrying a heavy steel battering ram sprinted toward the custom built oak front doors. The violent, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the ram echoed through the audio feed, a primitive, brutal sound dismantling the final barrier between Richard and accountability. The doors splintered and blew inward. The tactical team surged into the foyer, their flashlights cutting chaotic swaths through the darkness of the mansion's interior. "They're moving to the east wing," I noted, my voice a flat, frictionless hum. His study. The camera feed we were watching was external, but Theo had also managed to slice into the estate's internal security network. He swiped the tablet screen, switching to a camera positioned high in the corner of Richard's mahogany paneled office. Richard was there. He wasn't wearing his bespoke suits or his polished senatorial smile. He was in a rumpled white dress shirt, pacing erratically behind his massive desk. The floor around him was littered with shredded documents and an overturned trash can. He looked like a trapped animal, his face pale, his eyes wide and frantic. The door to the study burst open. 5 FBI agents poured into the room, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at his chest. "Richard Ashford, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Put your hands where we can see them." The lead agent roared, his voice booming through the tablet's speakers. Richard froze. The charismatic facade, the golden boy persona that had charmed millions, disintegrated completely. He raised his hands, trembling so violently that the cuffs of his shirt fluttered. "I'm a United States Senator," he stammered, his voice cracking, high and thin. "This is an outrage. I have immunity." "You have a federal indictment for wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, Senator," the lead agent interrupted, his tone devoid of any respect. He holstered his weapon and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He closed the distance between them, grabbed Richard's arm, and roughly twisted it behind his back. The cold, metallic click-click of the ratcheting cuffs was sharp and distinct, a sound that sealed his fate. "Turn around," the agent commanded. Richard was forcibly turned to face the room. He looked broken, diminished. He wasn't looking at the agents. His eyes were fixed on something on his desk. Theo zoomed the camera feed in. It was a framed photograph, the one taken on the day he announced his candidacy. He was smiling his brilliant fake smile, and I was standing slightly behind him, out of focus. the silent architect of the moment. "Elena," Richard whispered, the word barely audible over the agents shouting instructions to secure the premises. I watched his face, searching for a flicker of the man who had unplugged my life support without a second thought. But there was nothing left. The predator had become the prey, stripped of his fangs and his stolen territory. "The company filed for Chapter 11 2 hours ago," Theo said quietly, breaking my concentration. "Helios Energy is officially bankrupt. The board locked him out entirely." I nodded, my eyes never leaving the screen. The financial empire was ash, the political career was a smoking crater, and the man himself was currently being frog-marched out of his own home by federal authorities. The feed switched back to the external camera. The FBI agents emerged from the shattered front doors, flanking a handcuffed Richard. The flashing red and blue lights of the SUVs painted his pale face in strobe-like bursts of color. He stumbled slightly on the stone steps, a humiliating display captured by the motion sensor security lights. They guided him to the back of a black SUV and shoved him into the rear seat. The heavy door slammed shut with a final, resonant thud. The convoy slowly pulled away, the red tail lights disappearing into the Long Island night. The estate was left in the hands of evidence teams, a crime scene replacing a palace. I reached out and pressed the small button on the side of the tablet. The screen went black, plunging us back into the quiet, ambient light of the yacht. The silence stretched between Theo and me. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the Vance boardroom or the clinical silence of a hospital room. It was the vast, echoing silence of a battlefield after the last shot has been fired. Theo picked up a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon from a silver bucket of crushed ice. The cork popped with a sharp, celebratory crack. He poured the pale, effervescent liquid into two crystal flutes. He handed me one. The glass was chilled, the tiny bubbles rising in a frantic, joyful dance. "To the Queen," Theo said softly, raising his glass. I looked at him, recognizing the predator hiding beneath the cashmere. We had burned down an empire together. He had secured his family's dominance by eliminating his greatest political rival, and I had settled a debt that spanned 2 lifetimes. We were a devastating equation, a power couple forged in the fires of mutual destruction. "To the ashes," I replied, the crystal chiming clearly as our glasses met. I took a sip. The champagne was crisp, cold, and tasted flawlessly of victory. I walked to the edge of the teakwood deck, leaning against the polished stainless steel railing. The ocean breeze whipped my hair around my face. In the distance, the lights of Manhattan glowed, a million glittering diamonds scattered across black velvet. The city I had once helped him conquer, but this time I wasn't watching it from a hospital bed, paralyzed and dying. I was watching it from the apex, breathing the clean, salt air, alive and infinitely powerful. Richard Ashford was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, beginning a journey that would end in a concrete cell in a federal prison. His name would become synonymous with corruption, his legacy a cautionary tale. He would spend decades in a cage, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his freedom, remembering the woman who had put him there. I closed my eyes, letting the cool wind wash over me. The phantom pain in my chest, the echo of a sword that no longer existed, was finally, permanently gone. I had reclaimed my life, my intellect, and my future. I opened my eyes, the reflection of the city lights dancing in the dark lenses of my sunglasses. I took another slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The dark satisfaction settled deep within my bones, a permanent, freezing core. It was done. 3 years later, I stood in the expansive glass-walled office of Vance Strategic Solutions, overlooking Central Park. Theo, now my husband and the undisputed head of the sterling conglomerate, was finalizing a merger on the sofa. I muted the financial news playing on the wall monitor. The breaking headline read, Former Senator Ashford denied parole, ordered to serve remaining 15 years. A brief clip showed Richard, gaunt and aged in an orange jumpsuit, being led back to his cell. He looked broken, a ghost of his former self. I smiled, a thin, sharp curve of my lips, and turned my attention back to the city that was, unequivocally, ours. The game was over, and the board belonged to me.